You either report the news or make the news, but you can't do both. That was once a clear red line in journalism. Is it still, or is it an old-fashioned idea which was perhaps never entirely accurate to begin with? Joining us now to find out where that red line is in today's journalistic world, in the nation's capital, Francine, executive producer, Aboriginal People's Television Network National News. And here in studio, Desmond Cole, activist, freelance writer, and host on News Talk 1010, and Chris Selly, columnist with the National Post. And it's good to have you two here in our studio. Francine, nice to have you in the nation's capital as well, joining our discussion. Desmond, I have no hesitation in saying your recent episode with the Toronto Star is what prompted our discussion here on TVO tonight. So let's just confirm a few facts right out of the gate, shall we?
Yeah.
You're no longer a columnist with the Toronto Star because they fired you or you quit them?
I left.
You left. Mm-hmm. Your own choice?
Absolutely.
No pressure put on by them?
Oh, tons of pressure. Not just after my protest at the police board meeting a few weeks back, but for at least the last year around the content of my writing. So there's always been conflict and conversation about what I write and not just how I act.
Conflict about what you write, but did it ever get to the point where they said, if you don't adhere more to our standards, we're going to have to let you go?
No, and I actually think that that's actually very interesting that they didn't ever say, we're going to have to let you go if you do this or if you do that, or that they didn't fire me immediately, because apparently this idea of a line that I've crossed, which the Star has never really actually defined, that's supposed to be central to this notion of journalism. So why did they come and call me into their offices and say, not you're fired, not here's what we hope will happen next time, not let's have a conversation about the way forward, but simply we only want to tell you what the rules are and we don't want to have any further conversation, which was my conversation with Andrew Phillips. It seems bizarre for something so important and integral to journalism, doesn't it?
Andrew Phillips being the guy who runs the op-ed page.
That's correct.
Okay, let's just go back to your time when you started at the Toronto Star. Were the rules of the road made clear to you at that point?
No, and they're not to any freelance writer of that organization that I'm aware of. There isn't a pattern where you're brought in to sign something, where policies and procedures are gone over with you. So no, this expectation was never given to me in the first place. But I would hasten to add that if this is the Star's expectation, their own journalists have broken it numerous times. And it seems to be in my case that they had to draw this line, whereas the Star has helped other activists engage in their journalism and defended it when others came criticizing them.
But they felt that your getting up at a police board meeting in the city of Toronto to express your deep concern about the way the police were doing particular business, for them that was a line crossed.
Yeah, I'm talking about white supremacy. I'm talking about anti-Black racism. I'm not talking about the climate. I'm not talking about other issues that perhaps would make them more comfortable. And I think that this goes right to the top. So when I talk about having conflicts about what I wrote, a year ago, John Hondrick, the head of the board of Torstar Corporation, took me out for lunch and said, I think that you're writing about race too often. And right after that happened, my weekly column became a every other week column.
What did you infer from that?
I inferred that he's very uncomfortable with the way that I'm approaching the topic of white supremacy in Canada. And I also think it's probably very likely that powerful people in this city who I'm calling out in the police service and at City Hall are leaning on John Hondrick and saying, this isn't fair, this isn't right, you need to do something about this. I think that's the obvious subtext.
Here, we should explain we did invite the public editor of the Toronto Star to participate in our discussion. Scheduling didn't permit her to be here, but we put that on the record. And let's get your colleagues involved in the discussion here and find out where they sit on things. Francine, I want to go to you. Let's start here. Are there in journalism acknowledged codes of conduct for how much activism either is or is not permitted by columnists who write opinion pieces? Not reporters, but columnists who write opinion pieces. What's your take on that?
Well, APTN has no problem paying columnists for their opinion pieces. And we see a distinction between both, being a columnist and writing an opinion and being a working journalist for a national network. So, any time you want to start writing for a news outlet, I think you, as a journalist, you also have that responsibility to know where your lines are, to know what the policy of that news organization is, whether or not they have a policy on your activism or whether or not they have a policy that also applies to columnists. So, I mean, we see the distinction. We would pay a columnist for their opinion piece and see that distinction and make that distinction clear in our publications as well.
But let me understand this. Is that to say that if, for example, there were an issue of great importance to any particular Indigenous community, and you had somebody who you were bringing on to offer an opinion on the national news, for example, is it made clear to that person that it's one thing for them to opine on your network about this, but we don't want to see you holding any placards at any demonstrations? Is that kind of thing made clear?
We have a clear distinction between who's a guest and who's a journalist on our network. We do make that distinction clear when we introduce people who are part of a panel, whether it's on our show In Focus or if it's on Nation to Nation. If we're talking to a media panel, we'll distinctively say that these are journalists and make it clear that they're on our show to offer their opinion.
Now, you're an executive producer, so I take it you regard yourself as a journalist as opposed to an activist. Is that right?
Absolutely. I don't see that I could ever be both.
Therefore,
I'm a journalist.
So I will not find you holding a placard at a demonstration someday.
No, you won't find me doing that. You won't find me participating in peaceful protests, whether it be a round dance or a sit-in anywhere. And it doesn't matter if I'm on the clock or off. You'll never find me doing that.
Okay, that's Francine's situation because she is a quote-unquote journalist in the classic sense of the word, an observer and a conveyor of information, but not necessarily a participant in that. Chris,
Yeah.
You operate in a slightly more gray area. You are a columnist. You're allowed to say what you think in your pieces, right?
Yeah.
Same kind of question to you. Is it clear to you, or has the National Post ever said to you, here's what's okay, here's what crosses the line?
No, that discussion hasn't happened. I've never, unlike the Globe and the Star and some other outlets, the National Post doesn't really have these sort of hallowed tablets of journalistic standards.
You're saying that with your tongue really firmly implanted
Well,
in your cheek.
it's just they tend to get these newspapers in trouble more than they seem to help them, is all I mean, when they try to turn to them. I would suspect that if I turned up at a protest in support of something that I write in favor of, that eyebrows might get raised. For me, that's just not really in my nature to go to a protest, even if I wasn't a columnist, I don't think. So I think I'm not surprised that the Star tried to draw this distinction, and I can sort of understand why the police board meeting, disrupting a police board meeting or a city council meeting for that matter, might sort of be perceived to cross a line. What I don't think they managed to do was explain that, it seemed to me that basically looking at it from the outside with no outside information, it seems that they just thought, oh, this is too much. And it's fine, they can publish whoever they want, but then they tried to turn to their journalism standards and say, reporters or journalists can never be the news, journalists can't be activists, and within minutes, everyone online was saying, well, hang on a second. I mean, Catherine Porter, when she was at the Star, her title was social justice activist / columnist. Michelle Landsberg was, famously an activist columnist. This is what a lot of people associate the Star with. I mean, if this hadn't happened, I would be pointing to the Star as an example of how a columnist absolutely can be an activist. And because why not really? At the end of the day, you're putting your view out there.
There are two names that he's mentioned, at least two names, of columnists who have certainly participated very significantly in big public issues of the day, without, it seems, being condemned by the Toronto Star for doing so. So what do you think's going on here?
There's so many. We could go on all day, but I'm also interested in what activism is defined as being. Because we keep saying placards at a rally as if that's the only kind of activism that exists. And as Naomi Klein, who is maybe the most well-known in my time activist and journalist from this country, internationally anyway, as Naomi Klein pointed out recently on my radio program, somebody by the name of David Frum, who you might know, who's been on this show a million times, united the right in Canada. He worked behind the scenes to help what now is the Conservative Party of Canada come into fruition. everyone calls him a journalist. So he didn't have to hold up a placard in order to get that done.
No, but they didn't call him a journalist when he was writing speeches for George W. Bush. He's kind of moved from journalism to activism to participant.
But nobody, I just don't see these ultimatums. The Star, just to use them as the example because we're talking about them, will pay activists to write opinion pieces in their columns. So they are giving money to activists who are putting opinions in their newspaper, and that is fair game for them if it's a one-off. But again, so we get into this idea of, so where is the line? The Toronto Star never tells you where the line is, but if you put your fist up in Black liberation at a protest, you've obviously crossed the line that no one ever defined.
Francine, I'm wondering from an Indigenous point of view, because there are overlapping issues here about Indigenous people feeling like their rights aren't being observed, Black Canadians feeling like their rights haven't been observed, so I'm sensing an overlap. But I wonder whether you think, do you have any sympathy for Desmond's position here on this as a result?
I do, actually. You know, there wasn't a clear representation of Indigenous voices in this country, which was why the Aboriginal People's Television Network was created, so that there could be more of those authentic voices being broadcast throughout the country and internationally through the web. So I am sympathetic to that, and I know that from each journalist there is a passion in each person, and that might be looked at similar to being an activist, but there's always that passion, you know, for your beat, for your topic, for that issue that you want to continuously report on and possibly make change in society with that particular issue. So I think at the heart of some journalists that there is an element of activism, but you have to show the public and the people that you're reporting to or writing for that you are unbiased and that the opinion within the words of your piece isn't what you're trying to convince them to follow. You know, journalists and we'll say columnists now too, they're very influential. I feel that we have a huge responsibility to the public. You know, we're in positions of power with the reporting that we do, so we have a responsibility to remain unbiased, and it's one of the first lessons that you learn in journalism is to never show your bias or your political colors.
For what it's worth, I don't think that's what's at issue here. To me, and Chris, let me put this to you, the issue is whether this fellow sitting beside me here crossed any kind of official or unofficial line that he may have or may not have been told about, which says people with opinions who write on our op-ed pages are allowed to do this, but they're not allowed to do this. I want to know from you, as a guy who's got opinions, but who has already told us we're not going to find you, here I go again, with a placard at a demonstration. I want to know whether you think he crossed the line by getting up at a police services board meeting and saying, I'm shutting this meeting down until I get some action for this issue that I care so much about.
No, I'm not aware of any line in journalism. You know, this is not some sort of universally accepted idea that he would have crossed the line. Absolutely not. But I think Francine hit on something key, which is what the public perceives. You know, I can't imagine that any Toronto Star reader mistook Desmond Cole's writing for sort of hard news, and I can't imagine that, you know, when you run an op-ed from you know, an activist, you state, you know, their interests, right? That if they're writing on behalf of whatever organization, you lay that out, and so your readers know what's going on. And Desmond's writing was nothing if not an open book. I mean, it was as transparent as you could get.
Chris, I want to push back on this because that requires a level of media literacy that I'm not sure exists. Are you sure that people understand that if somebody writes a piece on the front page of the Toronto Star, or any newspaper for that matter, that is meant to be a straight news story, that there's a distinction between just the facts, ma'am, on the front page of the paper versus what they'll see as opinion on the op-ed page?
I'm not sure that they will see an exact distinction, but I think that it's the responsibility of the media to provide that impression to people, to readers or to viewers. I think that, you know, it's all I'm saying is that what's important is what the public perceives. It's not these red lines and who is a journalist and who is an activist and who is a columnist. That's, I don't think, is of interest to people.
I mentioned media literacy and I saw you go like this right away.
I want to talk about literacy too, because I agree that maybe the average reader thinks that everybody who writes for the Star is secretly funding some special fund for lefties. I don't know, right? But we have a responsibility as the media to explain what these distinctions are. We clearly haven't. But beyond that, this issue of bias, I don't agree with Francine here. I don't believe my job is to be unbiased. I believe my job is to be honest and accurate and fair.
But you don't present yourself as a straight up the middle objective journalist, so no one expects you to be unbiased.
Find me one who is, Steve. That person does not exist there. We're essentially creating this objective that is not human, and then pretending that we're trying to get as close to it as possible. What I think is actually better is to lay your biases out on the table. What I did report on carding in the so-called tradition of objective journalism for about 3 years. And when I decided I could not do that anymore, I announced it to the whole world at a police services board meeting. I told everybody, this is hurting me, it's hurting my community, and to stay in this neutral space that's controlling me as a journalist, I can't do it anymore. So everyone, from now on, when I write about these things, know that that's not the kind of work that I'm personally trying to do. If you're open about that, I don't see what the problem is. So again, like, if you have an activist on your show, if you have somebody who blocks pipeline roads or who stands up in really big, like, because we seem to have a problem with the civil disobedience stuff. That's what we seem to be defining as activism. Can't you tell your readers that that's what that person does? That's where they're coming from. Make up your own mind. Why do we have to pretend to the reader that that person is going to provide all opinions or provide no opinion and just be in some neutral space? I don't think those things are possible.
Because those have, well, this is why we're having you on the program. Those have been the rules of the road for the last however many decades, which is there's a person over in that corner who just goes out, finds the facts, and regurgitates them as nicely as possibly.
And that's a reporter.
For the news section,
Yeah,
and that's a reporter. And then there's guys like him who are supposed to put opinions on the op-ed page. And then apparently, you're telling us there's a new kind of beast out there, which is a person like you who's allowed to be an activist and a journalist and an op-ed person all at the same time.
I just don't know how so many of my other colleagues in this industry are not being activist. I think it's so bizarre to describe what people are doing. Because, yeah, so for example, I will say on policy X, here's what I think should be done. Here's even what I think people can do if they want to get to policy objective X. I don't know a good opinion writer in this country that doesn't do that.
Francine, I want to have you comment on what Desmond seems to be saying, which is that, you know, all of us who say we're up the middle on issues and we don't bring bias or opinion to our reporting, that we're just the facts man, it's a bunch of hypocrisy and it doesn't really exist. What's your view on that?
It's been the foundation of journalism for a very long time. The public has come to expect that of journalists as well. And we're dealing with a very informed public. Now they're able to search the facts that you're producing in your pieces. You know, so yes, there is a line between journalism and activism. I'm going to just stick to that because it's been the foundation of this industry for a long time.
I'm just going to come back real quick again and say I'm talking about making opinions here. I work with people like Wendy Gillis and Jim Rankin, or I did at the Star, who reported on carding without trying to insert their personal opinions into what they were reporting about carding. Now, just because I have personal opinions does not mean I'm not relying on the same facts that they reported on. I am. I'm adding some kind of slant and analysis to that. I'm surprised we need to have this conversation in Canadian media in 2017. I can't do.
I'm glad we're having this conversation today.
I can't do the slant and analysis and opinion part objectively. That is on its face impossible. We can report as straight and as down the middle as we possibly can on what we believe the facts to be. But if you want opinions, if you want analysis, then ask for fairness there. Ask for accuracy, ask for honesty. Don't ask a columnist to be unbiased.
Francine, you said we're happy that you're happy we're having this conversation.
I think it's a really good debate to be having, you know, in light of, you know, not only what recently happened with Desmond, but, you know, we recently had Idle No More. And going forward, there's been fake news lately. So I think we just owe it to the public as journalists to maintain that objectivity, to be able to talk to the sides of the story that you need to talk to in order to inform the public where every side is coming from. Every columnist is entitled to their opinion, and that's what most outlets will pay that columnist for. Like I said, APTN sees the distinction. Maybe not every outlet sees that distinction or makes it clear enough to the staff that they're hiring or when they're making those contracts.
Well, can I do a follow-up with you on that since you raised Idle No More? There will probably be an impression in the minds of many Canadians watching APTN coverage of Idle No More that your network would have given sympathetic coverage to that group because they will infer or they will assume that the goals of Idle No More and the goals of many of the people at your network reporting on them line up. True or false?
That perception can definitely be out there. That's why we maintain a journalism policy and we adhere to the journalism standards. Like I had mentioned, the foundation of this industry that's been around for a long time. And that's what we do throughout our network, not just on the ground level of reporting, but on the producer level, the editor level as well. We're not going to go out there and only provide one voice, the Indigenous voice, which is what we were created for. But we want to hear the other side, and our viewers do too. I mean, our viewers would call us out if we were only reporting on the sides of those who are holding the protest cards.
Do you think the people who were covering that issue for your television network, in their hearts, agreed with Idle No More and that got into the coverage?
I can't speak to what's in the hearts of our journalists, but our coverage, we maintain journalistic standards and we want to be fair and balanced and have the sides of the story that represent that issue.
Going back to media literacy, Steve, I think that part of the reason that people might have a perception like you're naming about APTN is because the rest of the mainstream, on balance, does such a poor job of going into Indigenous communities, of highlighting Indigenous people who are talking about issues for themselves and for larger communities. And so it seems like, well, they must be biased. Why do they talk about this all the time? In the same way that I mentioned John Honderich. John Honderich was questioned about this by a columnist at The Star. He was questioned, did you really tell Desmond he writes about race too often? He said, no, I told him that he writes about carding too often. I wrote 26 columns for the Toronto Star from when I started as a regular columnist to the time that John Honderich had this conversation with me. 2 of them were about carding. He literally said he was writing about carding all of the time. And I think that that's very representative of a lot of the mainstream in Canada, is that the mainstream doesn't cover our issues. And then when somebody fills the void, they're always accused of going after it too much and being too biased towards it. So there's a larger media void here that we need to talk about.
Presumably you got hired in the first place because you're bringing something different to the party that they wanted. And presumably that different thing was a view on race relations in the country and the media's coverage of it to that point.
They can't pretend to have been surprised. I mentioned to you how I said that I was making this switch, but in 2016, so in November, about 5.5 months ago, I went to a police services board meeting and I once again gave a deputation. The Toronto Star covered that deputation with a reporter who reports straight news and called me both a freelance journalist and an activist. They acknowledged what they now say is impossible. I just don't understand what the problem is, Steve, except I understand exactly what the problem is.
All right, let's do a graphic here, shall we? Sheldon, let's bring this up. Here's former journalist Paul Adams writing in iPolitics. The most serious objection to activist journalists might be that, however noble Cole's action might have been, there will be a temptation for newspapers to start creating news just to cover it. How far is that from the stunt journalism Ezra Levant has pioneered in this country? And do we really all want to go in that direction? Okay, Chris, weigh in on that.
Well, as I say, I think if I was running a newspaper, I might not want my columnists, let alone my reporters, disrupting a police services board meeting. I think if Desmond was determined to disrupt every single police board meeting going forward, that I would start hearing a lot of complaints from important people in the city, and I might make the decision that, you know what, for whatever, either because I think it crosses a line or because I think it's just making life too difficult for our reporters or for myself, that, we'll just send him on his way.
But you'd need to make that clear to him ahead of time.
Oh, I think so. But then again, I don't think I would have hired Desmond as a columnist and then been surprised when he did that. You know what I mean? Like, it's, as we've been saying, all he did was go a little bit further, I guess, in doing what he was always doing. So, yeah, I mean, it's just without knowing for sure what was going on at the start, what was going on in their minds. It's difficult to sort of, it's difficult to really come down one way or the other.
Do you know Ezra Levant?
I have met Ezra Levant.
Do you?
I have met the gentleman in question.
Do you consider him a journalist?
I think we spend way too much time worrying about that question, but.
Well, as opposed to activist?
Well, again, I'm not sure where the. I mean, an opinionator. If an opinionator is a journalist, then I guess Ezra meets some definition of it. But I don't. He doesn't meet the definition of accuracy or fairness or, presenting either side. But in terms of creating content that goes out there that is at least theoretically informative, I guess he meets some definition of it. But I don't think that. I think that putting an adjective in front of journalist, if you're describing Ezra Levant, is and you can choose your adjective that you'd like. But I think that's. As long as we were able to do that, it doesn't matter really whether he meets some kind of holy definition.
Go ahead, Desmond. What do you want to say about him?
Well, nothing about him, but on the issue, this fear that what we're going to have is this out of control situation where people try to manufacture news so that they can cover it. Well, again, we are responsible for that on a case-by-case basis. There's no line that we just start falling uncontrollably down a hill and can no longer recover from. I mean, I don't like talking about rebel media, but I think it's pretty obvious if we leave behind these labels of are you a journalist, are you an activist, that they are not accurate a lot of the time, that they are not honest in the way that they report things. They cherry pick things that they want to talk about and leave out very critical things. And again, if people want to make that criticism about myself or anybody else that they think is making opinion, they should do so. They should say, you left out this really important fact, instead of saying you're not really a journalist, you're an activist. That's the conversation that we should be having, is about what's the content, and is the content being presented in a way that the average reader can use and think about and use to improve their understanding. That's really where this conversation is for me.
Let's do one more from Paul Adams here. In iPolitics, Sheldon, if you would. As the political and business elites of 100 years ago began demanding information they could rely on, creating one sort of pressure, a process of industrialization of the news was underway. Economies of scale meant that daily newspapers in smaller markets could not afford to put off potential readers just because they supported different political parties or took different views of, say, free trade. I wonder whether, Francine, come in on this. Does it feel to you that in an age of Trump, there may be fewer people who are interested in the distinction we're talking about today?
There may be fewer people interested, but there's still that broader public that wants the news. They want the facts. They'll turn into that newscast at that certain hour just because they trust that source, or they'll open the pages of a certain newspaper because they trust that source, or they trust the journalists that are in those outlets reporting that particular news.
Chris, let me get you on that. Do you think in an age of Trump, we are less fussed today about who's a journalist, who's a columnist, and who's an activist?
I'm not sure if that has much to do with Trump. I mean, certainly there's been this big debate about, if you present both sides, and traditionally the idea was to present both sides and let the readers
decide,
bash it out. But if one side is just complete nonsense, and we had this debate in Toronto with respect to Rob Ford before that, do you report someone's transparently false statements as one side of the story, and the other side's easily verifiable statements as the other side of the story? I think there's a problem there. But I also think that the problem with the reverse is this move to sort of say, oh, they're Trump or Ford said this, which was a lie or which was not true, is that you alienate readers. You create a perception of bias there, and I agree with Desmond that everyone does have their biases, but I think that's the beauty of sort of a healthy media landscape, which I don't think we really have right now, is that it's not just the facts. I mean, when you have 10 reporters reporting on a story, either because of their own backgrounds or because of their own beliefs, not sort of opinions, but their own beliefs, or their institutions, their newspapers,
they're
or
all
their
going to
TV
choose
outlets.
to highlight or focus on different
Yeah,
things.
they're going to choose to present the facts in a bunch of different ways, and that's a really healthy thing. I mean, I think the goal of objectivity is a good one when you're a hard news reporter. It is, in some sense, impossible, but I think that a variety of voices, a variety of outlets should sort that out at the end of the day.
I wonder, Desmond, I'm going to read a quote to you now, which I think you're going to like, and you can tell me whether this reflects your views. This is Aziza Kanji, Director of Programming at the Noor Cultural Center, which is a Center for Islamic Learning and Celebration of Islamic Culture here in Toronto, who says, "Quietism is activism for the status quo. What is called objectivity often amounts to complicity or complacency with the existing distribution of power." You signing up for that?
100. I mean, Aziza nails it with that really, really good column that she wrote in the Toronto Star. But of course, I have tried to point out, and Aziza and many others have tried to point out, that there is a culture within our media, which we keep referencing here, which is, 100 years old or whatever it is. And that culture is not without its own money interests. It's not with its own historical patterns of who was allowed to be a journalist or columnist and who was not. It's not without any of these biases that we're talking about. And so just saying, well, what we're trying to do is report straight and report objectively and never get involved. I mean, so we're here in Toronto, but the Sun network is across the country. Does anybody think, looking at a cover of the Sun in Toronto or Ottawa or Vancouver, that it's not trying to be activist in many of the things it's saying? I just don't believe people think that. Just like the Toronto Star has come out and said, we're campaigning on behalf of this or that or the other thing because we think it's right or wrong. We think it's in the public interest. So what's been lost here is journalists taking a stand in what they believe based on, again, all of their straight reporting to be in the public interest. We haven't talked about that at all. I think that that's kind of a responsibility of journalism, not to collect the facts and say to who we all agree is a poorly educated and poorly literate media, you decide. We won't help you. We won't give you any context. Here is a dump of straight information, you decide. Nobody that I've seen in Journalism Canada has ever operated that way, and I don't think it helps, but I do think that Aziza's making a really important point. The status quo usually says, don't interfere with government too much the way I did. It usually says, let the institutions work the way they're working and don't make too much change in those institutions too quickly. And what do we see in our media culture itself, in our media institutions? Slow to change, slow to bring on the so-called diversity that we all want. They are a problem of this larger issue of not being able to challenge institutions and change them and revolutionize them quickly enough.
Mr. Cole, you're going to get the last word. Francine Compton, it's good of you to join us on the line from the nation's capital. We'll watch APTN National News if we don't already going forward, and we thank you for your contribution to our program tonight.
Thank you.
And back here in studio, Desmond Cole. You can still listen to him on News Talk 1010, although you can't read him in the Star anymore. And there's Chris Selly as well, columnist with the National Post. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.